Cheyenne, Wyoming, October of 1882. A 9-year-old boy stood on a wooden platform in a cattle market, clutching his dead mother's Bible, with a cardboard number hung around his neck. And he asked a question that would change 3 lives and eventually change the law of an entire territory. He looked up at the tallest, coldest rancher in Wyoming, and he said, "Mister, can orphans cost less than horses? Because I will work hard, I promise." What that scarred rancher did next silenced the whole street, and what the widow watching from across the road decided to do about it. Well, that is the story you are about to hear.
Welcome back to our little corner of the campfire, friends. This is the channel where we tell the forgotten stories of the American West. Tales of cowboys and frontier love, of mothers who never gave up, of the quiet bonds between broken souls, and of the kindness that held the prairie together when the law could not. Today's story will remind you of something this world has been trying to make us forget: that no human soul was ever meant to carry a price tag. That love is not something we find by accident. It is something we choose every single day. If this story warms your heart even halfway through, do me one small favor. Tap that like button. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. Share this with a woman who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss a story. Now settle in. Pull the blanket up. Let me tell you about the day a boy asked a question nobody in Wyoming was ready to answer.
I used to think the worst day of my life was the day they buried Thomas. I was wrong. The worst day of my life was a Tuesday in October in Cheyenne with $50 and a question from the mouth of a child. A question I will carry to my own grave. But before I tell you about the boy, I have to tell you about the ring in my coat pocket that morning. My name is Clara Whitfield. I was 34 years old, a widow. I had buried a son at 6 and a husband 3 years after him. I had $39 in the Cheyenne bank, and I owed $340 on the 1st of January. 90 days. That was all the time I had before the house Matthew built me belonged to another man. So I walked down Eddy Street that October morning with my wedding ring in my coat pocket, heading for Goldberg's Jewelers. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse sweat. The Union Pacific whistle blew from the rail yard. I counted my steps. I always counted my steps when I was trying not to think. I turned the corner onto Railroad Avenue, and I heard the auctioneer. I should have walked past. I meant to walk past. But something in me stopped, and I looked. 7 children, standing in a row on a wooden platform. The oldest looked 14. The youngest could not have been more than 6. Each one wore a square of cardboard around the neck, with a number written large. Behind them hung a whitewashed board with black letters. Healthy Orphans. Indenture terms available. See Mr. Pratt. I stood there in the street with my hand in my coat pocket, squeezing that wedding ring until my fingers went numb. You have to understand, I knew about the orphan trains. Everyone in the West knew. The churches in New York and Boston put the children on the rail cars and sent them out to the farms and ranches because there were too many of them in the cities and not enough hands in the West. It was supposed to be charity. It was supposed to be rescue. This was not rescue. This was a cattle market with smaller stock. And that is where I first saw him. The third boy from the end of the line. Small for his age, a cap of dark hair and a Bible clutched to his chest with both arms. He was staring straight at a tall man in a black hat, 30 feet from where I stood. A man with a long scar running down the right side of his face. Silas Crane. I had heard the name the way everyone in Wyoming heard it. The rancher at the Bar C who did not come to socials, did not come to church, did not dance at the harvest. A man people tipped their hats to and then whispered about. Silent Silas, they called him. The auctioneer, a heavy man in a dirty coat, was calling the bids. Pratt said, "A healthy boy, gentlemen. 7 years indenture, reads and writes, $50. Who will say 60? A gaunt man in the front row raised one finger. Buford Kane. a rancher from down south near the Laramie line. I had heard stories about Kane, too, and none of them were good. His boys never lived out their terms. Pratt said, 60 from Mr. Kane, 65? Silas Crane did not move. He was looking at the boy, and only at the boy. The boy was looking at Buford Kane, and I saw the child's small shoulders go tight, the way a rabbit goes tight when it sees the hawk. 65, Pratt said. Anybody? Nobody raised a hand. 60 going once. And then the boy did a thing he was not supposed to do. He stepped out of the line. Pratt shouted. A guard started toward him, but the boy was already walking small and steady across the dirt to Silas Crane. He stopped in front of the tall man and tilted his head back to meet his eyes, and he spoke in a voice that was trembling but not broken. He said, Mister, can orphans cost less than horses? Because I will work hard. I promise you, I will work harder than any horse you ever owned. I just do not want to go with that man. The whole street went quiet. I swear to you, the whole street. Silas Crane looked down at that boy for what felt like a full minute. His face did not change, but I saw his right hand hanging at his side close into a fist so tight the knuckles went white as bone. Then he reached into his coat. He took out a worn leather billfold. He counted out bills, slow and careful, in front of God and everybody. 7 of them. He walked 2 steps forward and dropped them into Pratt's open palm. He said, $90. I am not bidding. I am buying him out, right now, before anyone else opens their mouth. Buford Kane stood up from his chair. Kane said, Now hold on, Crane. I had the bid. Silas turned to face him, slow, and he spoke one sentence. One sentence I will remember until the day I die. Silas said, Have you ever been a boy that nobody wanted, Mr. Kane? Kane did not answer. Silas took the paper Pratt handed him. He signed it. Then he did something I did not expect. He knelt down on the dirt right there in front of the crowd to put himself at eye level with the child. Silas said, Boy, listen to me now. I did not buy you. Nobody can buy a person. I paid that money to get you out of here. The day you are grown and want to walk away, my door is open. But until that day, you have a bed, a table, and a name. Do you have a name? The boy said, Elijah, sir. My mama called me Eli. Silas said, Eli, I am Silas. Come on, son. And he stood up and he put one big hand on the boy's shoulder, and he walked him away from that platform without looking back. I stood in the street and I wept. First time in 2 years I had wept where anyone could see me. A strange woman in a blue bonnet pressed a handkerchief into my hand and walked on without a word. I walked to Goldberg's. I stood outside the shop for 10 minutes. And then I put that ring back in my coat pocket and I walked away. I could not sell it. Not that day. Not after what I had just seen. I went back to Mrs. Hattie Monroe's boarding house where I was staying for my trip to town. Mrs. Hattie took one look at my face and put a kettle on. She did not ask. Hattie never asked. She just sat down across from me and waited. Finally I said, Hattie, I saw a man buy a child today. Hattie said, Child? This is Cheyenne. You see that every season. I said, No, I saw a man refuse to buy a child and pay for him anyway. Hattie looked at me a long time over her teacup. She said, Who was he? I said, Silas Crane. Hattie set her cup down slow. She said, Huh. I said, What does huh mean? She said, It means that man has buried his own. 7 years back. Wife and a little boy both, in a fire. He has not looked sideways at a living soul since. And you say he bought a child today? I said, Yes. Hattie said, Huh. That night I did not sleep. I sat up at the little desk in Hattie's spare room and I wrote one line in my journal. I wrote, The man who would not buy a child may be the only man in Wyoming who will not try to buy me. And I thought about the land. And I thought about Victor Ashford, the banker, who had told me 2 weeks before that if I would only marry him, he would make my debts disappear. I had walked out of his office. I had meant to sell the ring instead. But there was another way, a mad way, a way that required knocking on the door of a scarred man I had never met. I lay awake until the first gray light came through the window. And by the time the rooster crowed across the yard, I had made up my mind. I was going to the Bar C. It took me 3 days to get out there. I hired a rig and a driver from a livery off 16th Street, 47 miles west of Cheyenne, into the Laramie Valley. The road was rough and the wind bit through my coat, and I had plenty of time to sit and ask myself if I had lost my mind. I had, but I had lost it a long time before October. We came over the last ridge at about 3 in the afternoon, and I saw the Bar C for the first time. A 2-story log house, peeled and weathered gray. A big red barn. Good fencing, straight and tight, but not a curtain at a single window. Not a garden. Not one sign of a woman's hand anywhere I looked. I paid the driver and told him to wait at the end of the drive. I walked the last quarter-mile alone because I did not want to arrive in a hired rig like some city woman begging. I came around the barn, and I found them. Silas Crane and a tall old black man, hauling the carcass of a cow. Wolves, by the look of the wounds. And there was the boy, Eli, standing off to the side with a bucket of water, trying to help and trying not to cry. Silas was bleeding. A long red line down the back of his right hand where a horn must have caught him when he lifted the carcass. I did not introduce myself. I walked straight to him, tore a strip off my wool shawl, and I tied a pressure wrap on his hand. I bit the knot closed with my teeth. I did not know I still remembered how. I had not done anything like it in 18 years, but my hands remembered. My hands. Silas stood there with his bloody hand in mine and looked at me like I had dropped out of the sky. He said, "Ma'am, who are you?" I said, "I am the woman who came to knock on your door. Go on and finish your work. I will wait." The old man, who I would later learn was Tom Garrett, watched me with an expression I could not quite read. Eli dropped his bucket and stared. Silas finished the work. Tom took the boy in to wash up. I waited on the porch until Silas came out of the barn, his hand wrapped in the strip of my shawl, and motioned me into the house. The house was cold, not in temperature, in feeling. The parlor had a piano in the corner and 200 books on shelves that went up to the ceiling, and every surface was dusty. There was a rocking chair with a white sheet over it. There was a small child's shoe on the mantel, brown kid leather, sized for a 4-year-old. I did not ask. We ate supper at a scarred oak table. Me, Silas, Tom, Eli. The boy would not look at me. He kept his eyes on his plate and ate too fast, the way a boy eats when he's afraid the food might be taken away. I waited until the coffee came. Then I said my piece. I said, "Mr. Crane, I have come to offer my services as a housekeeper for the winter, November through March, $40 a month. I will sleep in the parlor, I will cook and clean, and I will help raise the boy." Silas did not answer right away. He drank his coffee. He looked at Tom. He looked at Eli. And then he looked at me for a long time. He said, "I do not need a housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield. Tom and I can cook what we need. But I will be straight with you, because I hate wasting time. And I figure you do too." I waited. He said, "You are losing your land. The whole valley knows. I know because Matthew Whitfield was my brother at Shiloh." I went cold all the way through. I said, "He never told me." Silas said, "Matthew was not a storyteller, but he wrote me a letter 3 months before he died. I owe him my life, twice over. I tried to help you without you knowing it. The Cheyenne Bank sold your debt before I could buy it back. I could not reach it in time." I did not know what to say. I sat there with my cup halfway to my mouth. Silas said, "So I'm going to make you a different offer, and you can tell me no, and that is fine. But hear me out." I nodded. He said, "Marry me, 12 months on paper. You will be Mrs. Crane. You will raise Eli, teach him his letters, teach him his prayers, teach him what a decent woman's house feels like. At 12 months, we divorce. You walk away with 150 acres south-facing, which is enough to rebuild your place. $600 in cash besides. Separate rooms. No one touches anyone. This is not romance, Mrs. Whitfield. This is two grown people getting each other through the winter. I sat there a long time. I looked at Eli. His spoon was halfway to his mouth. He had forgotten to eat. I said, "Why not just hire a housekeeper? Why a wife?" Silas said, "Because a housekeeper can walk off. A wife, even a paper one, stays. And that boy has lost too many people already." I thought about it. I thought about Victor Ashford. I thought about the ring in my pocket. I thought about waking up in February with no home and no land and no place in the world. And I thought about the boy. I said, "I accept your terms, Mr. Crane." Eli looked up from his plate. Just for a moment. And I swear something inside me, something that had been dead for 2 years, gave one small twitch like a finger moving after a long sleep. I said, "But I have one condition." Silas said, "Name it." I said, "If the boy chooses to call me Mama one day, I do not want you to tell him not to. It does not have to mean anything to you. But if he says it, let him say it." Silas looked at me a long moment. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, that is not a condition. That is a gift." Yes. And that was how I came to be married to a man I had met 3 days before. Judge Harlan did the ceremony in his chambers the following Tuesday. Hattie was the witness. Tom brought the boy. When the judge reached the words about loving and cherishing, Silas did not say them. I did not either. We just signed. Silas slid a plain brass ring onto my finger. He said, "You can give it back the day we divorce." And I walked out of that courthouse with a new name I had not asked for, a child I had not born, and a husband I had barely looked in the eye. That was the night I knew I was walking into an arrangement. What I did not yet know was that I was walking into a life. The first week at the Bar C was the quietest week of my life. Silas showed me the house. Kitchen, dining room, the library with its 200 books, which surprised me more than anything. The upstairs guest room that would be mine. He did not take me into the room at the end of the hall, and I did not ask. I understood without being told that was Eleanor's room. Eleanor, the wife in the ground. Benjamin, the child in the ground, the shoe on the mantel. The shoe on, oh no. I understood because I had my own room like that back at my place. A small room with a crib still in it, though the crib was empty and had been empty for 2 years. That first week, Silas rode out before dawn and came back after dark. He was a man who worked, so he did not have to sit still. I understood that too. Tom Garrett was the one who taught me the rhythm of the house. Tom was 72 years old, and he had come up from Mississippi after the war, a freedman with no people and no place. He had been with Silas since 1867. He had helped lay every fence post on the Bar C. Tom said to me that first morning, "Mrs. Crane?" I said, "Please call me Clara." Tom said, "No, ma'am, you are Mrs. Crane in this house, that matters." And I did not argue, because I understood what he was telling me. That whatever the paper said about 12 months, inside these walls I was to be treated with the dignity of a wife, and so was I to treat him with the dignity of a man. Tom Garrett had been called boy his whole childhood. He was never going to be called anything but Mr. in my hearing. Eli followed me everywhere that first week. He did not speak much, he just stayed close enough to see me. If I was in the kitchen, he was on the floor with a wooden block. If I was in the parlor, he was at the window. He was testing whether I would disappear. On the 5th morning, I was baking bread. He came down the stairs barefoot, his hair sticking up, and he stood in the kitchen doorway watching me knead. He said, "Mrs. Clara, ma'am, can I help?" I said, "Yes, Eli, come and crack these eggs." He came over. He cracked them careful, one at a time, like he was handling glass. Then he said, without looking at me, "Mrs. Clara, if I behave real good, will you stay past the spring?" I stopped kneading. I knelt down on the kitchen floor to put myself at his eye level. And I wanted to lie. God help me, I wanted to lie. I wanted to say, "Yes, child, yes, forever, yes." But I could not lie to that boy, not with what he had already lost. I said, "Eli, I do not know what the spring will bring, but I know this. Today I am here, tomorrow I will be here. And I will never disappear on you without telling you first. That is my promise." He nodded like a small old man. When I turned back to the bread, I saw him wipe his eyes on his sleeve. Then he went and got a spoon and helped me beat the eggs without another word. The second week, Silas started mending the western fence line. It sleeted for 3 days straight. I could not bear watching him out there from the kitchen window, so on the fourth morning I put on my coat and I carried a tin pot of hot coffee and a dry wool coat out to where he was working. He did not expect me. He took the coffee. He drank it without speaking for a long time. Then he said out of nowhere, looking out over the fence line, "Eleanor hated Wyoming. She was from Boston. Her daddy was a banker. I thought I could bring Boston to Wyoming for her. Books, a piano, silk dresses from Denver. I was wrong. She did not want things. She wanted to go home." He took another sip of coffee. He said, "I did not let her. I did not answer with words. I laid my hand over his cold one for just a moment, and I lifted it away." Silas looked at his own hand like someone had marked it. He said, "Thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Crane." I walked back to the house, and I did not look over my shoulder, but I could feel him standing there watching me go. The third week, I found the music. I had been teaching Eli to read from his mother's pocket Bible. It was worn soft at the edges. I turned one evening to the inside back cover, and there, written in small, neat hand, was a line of music. Notes and words both. The words were in a language I did not know. But Eli looked at them, and his whole small face lit up. He said, "My mama wrote that. She used to sing it to me. It is a lullaby, in the old language from her mother's country, Ireland." I said, "Do you remember the tune?" He hummed a few notes, uncertain, then a few more. I am not a trained singer, but my mother had taught me to read music by the parlor piano when I was a girl. I looked at the notes on the page, and I could hear them, the way you can hear letters on a page. I sang it to him, soft, halting. I did not know the Gaelic words, so I hummed where I did not know them. Halfway through the third line, Eli started to cry. Not loud, just tears running down his face, while he stood very still, listening. I kept singing. I got to the end. He whispered, "Again." I sang it again. On the third time through, I realized Silas was standing in the doorway. He had come in from the barn. He had his hat in his hands. He was not coming in. He was just standing there, his hand on the doorframe, listening. I did not look at him. I finished the song. When I looked up, he was gone. I heard him out in the barn late that night. He was not working. I could hear that through the wall. He was just sitting out there in the dark. I did not go to him. Some grief does not want company. Not yet. The fifth week, there was a calving. Silas woke me at 2 in the morning. A quiet knock on my door. He said, "Mrs. Crane, I need smaller hands." I did not ask. I pulled my coat on over my nightdress, and I followed him out to the barn. The heifer was young and narrow, and the calf was turned wrong. We worked for 3 hours in the lantern light, blood to the elbows. Silas holding the mother still and me reaching where he could not reach. I had done worse things in the wilderness in 1864. I did not tell him that yet. When the calf finally came, slick and steaming into the straw, we both laughed. Just once, surprised laughter, like it had been shaken out of us. We stood outside in the gray dawn when it was done, washing up at the pump. The water was so cold it hurt. Silas said almost to himself, "You've got steady hands, Clara Crane." Clara Crane, not Mrs. Whitfield. Not a cold Mrs. Crane. Just my name. The name I had been given on paper 3 weeks before, spoken like it had always belonged to me. I did not say anything back. I just washed the blood off my forearms in the freezing water and went inside to start the fire for breakfast. The 6th week was when the chair changed. I should explain about the chair. The dining room table seated 4, but Silas always kept 4 chairs set. Himself at the head, one at his right for Tom when Tom ate inside, one at his left, which had been empty the first 6 weeks I lived there, and one directly across from him at the far end, which had also been empty. That fourth chair, the one across from his. I understood it the first time I sat down. That was Eleanor's place. I never sat in it. I took the seat at his left that first night, and I kept it, and Eli sat on a box I had padded with a folded quilt so he could reach the table. We ate around an empty chair for 6 weeks, and nobody said a word about it. On the Friday of the 6th week, I came down to supper, and I stopped in the dining room doorway. The chair was gone. In its place stood a proper child's high chair, wooden, plain, the right height for a 9-year-old boy. Silas had made it. I could tell by the fresh smell of the pine. Nobody said anything. Silas took his seat. Tom came in from washing up. Eli climbed into the new chair. I brought the stew to the table, and the three of us ate as a family for the first time. That night I sat up in my room and I wrote in my journal. I wrote, "I thought I came here to save land. I am beginning to be afraid I'm losing something else, the shell I built around my heart the day Thomas died, and I do not know anymore if I want to keep it." The first snow came hard in mid-November, 2 feet in one night. Silas and Tom spent 3 days digging out the cattle and breaking the ice on the water troughs. I stayed at the house with Eli, and we spent those 3 days in a kind of warmth I had almost forgotten existed. I taught him to knit. Badly, because I'm not much of a knitter myself. But we laughed over the crooked rows. I read to him from the books in Silas's library. Old books, good books. Hawthorne, Dickens. I read him the part of David Copperfield where David runs away to his aunt. And Eli listened so hard he forgot to blink. When Silas came in on the 3rd night, red-faced and exhausted, I had soup on the stove and bread in the oven, and Eli asleep on the parlor rug with a book on his chest. Silas stood in the doorway and looked at it all for a long time. He did not say anything, but he took his hat off slow and he hung it on the peg by the door instead of throwing it onto the chair like he usually did, and that was its own kind of speaking. 2 days later, I went into Laramie for supplies. Silas wanted to ride in with me. I told him no. I told him I needed some hours to myself, and I needed to stop by the postmaster to see if there was any mail from my lawyer in Cheyenne. Both were true. I did not tell him the other reason, which was that I needed one day not feeling watched. Not watched with unkindness, just watched. Laramie in November 1882 was a plank sidewalk town with 1 bank, 2 churches, 3 saloons, and a general store that sold everything from flour to coffins. I tied the wagon at the store and I went inside. That is where I saw Nell. She was 15 years old. I knew it the moment I looked at her, because I had seen her 3 weeks before on the platform in Cheyenne. She had been 3 places down from Eli in the line of orphan children. I had not forgotten her face. She was thin now in a way she had not been then. Her dress was mended badly at the shoulder and the hem, and she had a yellow bruise the size of a plum on the inside of her left wrist. She was buying thread. Her hands were shaking. She turned and saw me. I saw her recognize me, too. She went very still. I walked over to her, slow, so I would not spook her. I said quiet so nobody else could hear, "Your name is Nell, is that right?" She nodded. I said, "The boy. The one the tall rancher took that day. He is at my house. He is safe. He is fed. He is learning to read." Something broke in her face, just for a second. Not a smile, exactly. A thing trying to become a smile in a face that had forgotten how. She whispered, "I am so glad. Somebody should get out." I said, "Nell, who bought you?" She shook her head. She looked at the door. I said, "Nell, look at me. Who bought you?" She said, "The Harlows, south of here, a farm. I have to go, ma'am. Please, if I'm not back by dark." I said, "Nell, listen. I am Mrs. Crane. My husband is Silas Crane of the Bar C. If you ever need to come away from that farm, you come to us. Do you hear me?" She nodded once, quick, and she pushed past me and out the door. I watched her go. And I stood in the middle of that general store with a tin of coffee in my hand, and I felt something rise up in me that I had not felt since the war. Not grief, not even pity. Fury, a cold, steady fury of the kind that does not burn out. It just sits there and waits for its chance. I bought my supplies. I drove home. I did not tell Silas that night. I do not know why I did not. Maybe because I was not ready to hand him something I did not know what to do with myself. But I did tell Mrs. Hattie. The next time I wrote her a letter, I told her about Nell, and Hattie wrote back 3 weeks later, and all she said in her reply was, "I am listening now. You tell me anything you hear." I did not understand yet what she meant. I would understand later. A week after that, Victor Ashford came to the Bar C. He came in a black buggy with a matched pair of bays, a gentleman's rig. He drove up the road in the middle of the afternoon, and he walked into the house as if he owned the floorboards. I was in the kitchen. Silas was in the parlor with the ledger. Victor walked straight past me as if I were a servant and took a chair across from my husband without being offered one. He said, "Crane, good afternoon." Silas said, "Ashford." Victor set his hat on the table, which I took note of, because it is not a thing a gentleman does in another man's house, unless he means something by it. Victor said, "I will be direct. I represent a railroad concern. They want the Bar C, all 2,400 acres. $18 the acre paid in full in gold at signing. That is double the going rate in this valley. You could go anywhere with that kind of money. The boy could go to a Boston school. Mrs. Crane here could keep a stone house in Denver." Silas did not answer for a long moment. He poured Victor a cup of coffee he had not asked for, slow and deliberate. He slid it across the table. Then Silas said, "Mr. Ashford, I have a question for you." Victor smiled. "Ask it." Silas said, "Have you ever stood on your own land at sunrise and seen 400 head of cattle that you raised from the first calf? And have you ever known, standing there, that you belonged to that place more than it belonged to you?" Victor said, "I do not traffic in sentiment, Mr. Crane." Silas said, "Then you would not understand the answer. The answer is no. I will walk you to the door." Victor stood up slow. He picked up his hat. In the doorway he turned back, and he looked at me for the first time since he had walked in. He said, loud enough for Eli to hear, because Eli was coming down the stairs and Victor knew it, "Oh, Mrs. Crane, I nearly forgot. The boy's guardianship papers. I have been informed a notarization is missing from the file in Cheyenne. If a complaint were ever to be filed, the child might be returned to the system. A shame. Good day." He left. Silas stood in the doorway and watched his buggy drive away. His hand was on the doorframe and the knuckles were white again. He did not speak. Eli had heard. I know he had heard, because that night at bedtime when I tucked him in, he caught my sleeve. Eli said, "Mama, if they take me, can I run back?" First time he had called me Mama. I did not even notice in the moment. I only noticed later. I lay down on the bed next to him, and I put my arm around him, and I said, "Eli, listen to me. They are not taking you. I will die first. Silas will die first. You are ours. Do you hear me?" He nodded into my shoulder. I held him until he was asleep. Then I went downstairs and I sat by the fire for a long time. I had made a promise I was not sure I could keep. And I knew, sitting there, that if I wanted to keep it, I could not keep doing what I had been doing, which was waiting for other people to solve it. Something had to change in me. I did not know what yet, but something. The next morning, Tom Garrett nearly died. He was breaking a young horse in the corral. A strong, dark bay, half wild, bought cheap at a sale in Cheyenne because nobody else could handle him. Tom had a way with horses that I have never seen in another man. He talked to them. He waited them out. He could put a saddle on an animal that had never worn one, and the animal would stand for it, because he had spent 2 hours just standing beside it and breathing. But that morning the horse turned wrong. Or Tom did. I was in the kitchen when I heard Eli scream. I ran out. Tom was in the dirt. The horse had bolted and was tearing up against the far fence. Tom was not moving. There was blood coming from his right ear. Silas was on the North Range, 2 hours out. The nearest doctor was 2 days in Cheyenne. The hired hand, a boy named John from over by Rock River, stood frozen. I knew what I was looking at. Skull fracture. Pressure building under the bone. If we waited for a doctor, Tom would be dead by nightfall. And something happened to me. I cannot explain it. My voice changed. It went sharp and quick and low. It was not a voice I had used in 18 years. I said, "John, boil water. The biggest pot. Bring me the strongest whiskey in the house. A sewing needle, black silk thread, the cleanest knife in the kitchen, a fresh candle, 3 clean cotton sheets, and do not stop for anything. Go." He went. I knelt beside Tom. I checked his breathing. I checked the pupils of his eyes. I felt the soft place at his temple where the skull had caved. I had done this before, 123 times. I had done this in a tent at the wilderness with shells falling and mud running under my boots. I had done it under canvas at Spotsylvania with the surgeon so drunk he could not stand. So I had stood instead. I had done it at Cold Harbor with the boy's mother's letter in my apron pocket because he had asked me to read it to him. And he had died before I had gotten to the second paragraph. My hands were not shaking. For the first time in years, they were not shaking. I will not tell you every step of what I did in the next 30 minutes. It is not a thing for every ear. But I shaved a section of Tom's gray hair. I opened the skin with a clean cut. I eased the pressure of the blood pooling beneath the bone. I closed the torn membrane with small running sutures, the technique Dr. Heinrich Schneider had taught me in 1864 beside a creek in Virginia. I stopped the bleeding with direct pressure, and I disinfected with whiskey and prayer. When I sat back on my heels, my hands were still steady. Tom was breathing slow and even. John was white in the face. He said, "Mrs. Crane." I said, "Get a blanket. He needs to stay warm. Do not move him. I will sit with him." I washed the blood off my arms in a basin. My forearms and my apron were soaked. I did not change my apron. I did not have the energy to change my apron. I sat in a chair by Tom's bedside, and I waited. Silas and Eli rode in at about 4 in the afternoon. I heard the horses. I heard Silas's voice in the yard. I did not get up. Silas came into the kitchen. He saw Tom on the cot in the corner breathing. He saw me. He saw my forearms. He saw the apron. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said, very quiet, "Clara, who are you?" I looked up at him, and I told him. I said I was 16 in 1864. My father was a chaplain, 9th Corps. He went to the Virginia front. I went with him. I cut my hair and I wore a dead man's coat and I lied about my age. They figured out I was a girl inside of a week, but they did not send me home. They needed too many hands. Dr. Heinrich Schneider, a German surgeon, took me on. The wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. I amputated for 123 men. I held down boys while the surgeon cut. I stitched bodies back together until my fingers had no feeling left in them. I stopped. I said it. Then the war ended. I came home. My father was ashamed of me. He said I had to forget everything I'd learned. I did forget. Or I thought I did. I looked at my hands. I said the hardest part. I said, when Thomas fell sick with typhoid, I nursed him 6 days and 6 nights. I did everything I knew how to do. I tried to open his throat when he could not breathe anymore. My hands shook. I could not do it. He died in my arms. I had saved hundreds of strangers. I could not save my own boy. That is why I buried it all. Because these hands betrayed me when I needed them most. Silas did not speak. He walked across the kitchen. He knelt down in front of me. He took my 2 hands. He turned them palms up. He looked at them. He said, "Clara Crane, these hands just saved the only father I have ever had. These hands have saved the sons of hundreds of mothers. These hands did not betray you. Sometimes death is stronger than a human hand. That is not your sin. That is the limit of our kind." And he lowered his forehead onto my hands. He did not weep, but his shoulders shook once, just once. I sat very still. When he raised his head again, his eyes were wet. He said, "Stay with him tonight. I will bring you food. I will sit with Eli." I nodded. Tom made it through the night. He woke at about 10 in the morning. He looked at me and he said, "Mrs. Crane, what did you do to my head?" I said, "I fixed it, Mr. Garrett." He touched his bandage. He winced. He said, "Huh." He closed his eyes, and he slept for another 6 hours. That night, after he was steady and Eli was asleep, I went out to the porch. Silas was there. He handed me a heavy wool coat. I put it on. We stood at the rail and looked out over the valley. There was a full moon, and the snow caught the light and threw it back pale blue across the land. I said, "Silas, what do you know?" He said, "I do not know much, Mrs. Crane." I said, "I was orphaned, too, after the war. My father died when I was 18, and my mother had been gone 4 years by then. I had a brother, but he had gone west in 1861, and we never heard from him again. I know what that boy feels. I know what it is to be without people." Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So was I, Clara. So was I." I turned my head. He was looking out at the moon on the snow. I could see the scar on his face in the pale light. He said, "I was 7 when my parents died. 1849, cholera. I was sold out of a Missouri almshouse to a man named Elias Paxton. He had a little farm near Boonville. I worked for Paxton for 5 years. He did not feed me enough. He beat me with a harness strap. He never once called me by my name. He called me boy. I ran at 12. I lived rough for 2 years. I joined the Army at 15 and lied about my age to do it. That boy on the platform in Cheyenne, when he asked me that question. I was not buying a stranger. I was buying myself. You understand?" I understood. I reached for his hand. He let me take it. We stood there in the cold for a long time, the two of us holding hands on the porch of the Bar C while the moon moved across the snow. And I understood something I had not understood before. We were not two strangers pretending to be married for a child's sake. We were together, raising a boy who was each of us once upon a time. Christmas came on a Monday that year. The valley froze hard the first week of December, 20 below at night. The creeks were solid. The cattle pressed together in the lee of the barn for warmth. Silas and Tom rode out every morning to break ice and to count for losses. Tom was mostly healed, though he had a fresh white scar across his temple, and he moved slower now. And he let Silas do the heavy lifting without complaining, which for Tom was a large concession. I sewed a rag doll for Eli in secret, in the evenings after he was in bed. It was not much of a doll. Brown wool body, black button eyes, a patch of yarn for hair. I sewed it to look like a boy, not a girl, because Eli had told me once that when he was small, his mother had sewn him a boy doll and named it after him. I did not want to try to replace that. I just wanted him to have a doll again. Silas cut a small pine tree and brought it into the parlor on the 23rd. We set it in a bucket of sand. We hung strings of popcorn and cranberries on it, and Tom made little stars from folded tin. On Christmas Eve, we ate a turkey I had roasted, the first turkey I had cooked in 3 years. Eli ate so much I was afraid he would be sick. When he had opened his presents, the doll from me and a carved wooden horse from Silas, he fell asleep on the parlor rug, with the horse clutched in his small fist, and neither of us had the heart to wake him. Silas and I sat by the fire. The logs cracked. Outside, the wind moved over the valley like a slow river. Silas stood up. He walked to the mantel. He took down the small brown child's shoe. He came back. He sat in the chair across from me. He put the shoe in my 2 hands. He spoke low, looking at the fire, not at me. He said, "Benjamin, 4 years old. The fire was in the spring of 75. I was in Denver. I was buying barley seed. I came home after 6 days, and I found the house gone. I found this shoe in the ashes. It must have come off at the threshold when Eleanor tried to carry him out. She did not make it either. I have kept that shoe on the mantel for 7 years. I could not throw it away. I could not bury it. I could not move on." He stopped. He said, "Now I want you to keep it, somewhere safe. I cannot look at it every day anymore, not with you here, not with the boy here." I did not speak. I took the shoe in my 2 hands, and I did the thing I had not done in front of any living soul in 4 years. I wept. Not politely. Not the way a widow is supposed to weep at a funeral. I wept the way a grown woman weeps when a thing inside her finally breaks open. Ragged. Ugly. My whole body shaking. Sounds coming out of me I did not know I had in me. Silas slid off his chair onto his knees in front of mine. He did not kiss me. He did not speak. He lowered his head into my lap. And we were like that a long time, until the fire burned down to coals. Two grown people who had buried their children holding each other in a parlor on Christmas Eve. When I could finally breathe again, I said, "Silas, I have a box too. I want to show you." I went up the stairs. I came back with a small cedar box. I had had it with me every day for 4 years, and Silas had never seen it. I opened it. Inside, a handkerchief, white linen. Thomas had been holding it the last day, a tiny blonde curl tied with a piece of string. I had cut it from his head after he was gone. A pair of knitted socks, small as a grown man's palm. I had made them when I was carrying him. I took out the socks. I held them up. I said, "I knitted these when I did not yet know if he was a boy or a girl. I wanted them to fit either." Silas took the socks from my hand. He turned them over in his big hands. He set them gently back in the box. He put Benjamin's shoe in the box beside them. He said, "Our 2 children, together, not alone anymore." I closed the box. I set it on the small table by the fire. We sat there a long time, his head in my lap, my hand on his hair, neither of us speaking. When I went up to bed at last, near midnight, I stopped outside my own door. I stood there a full minute. Then I walked past it to the door of Silas's room at the end of the hall. I did not knock. I only rested my open hand on the wood of his door for 1 minute. Then I went back to my own room, and I got into my own bed, and I slept for the first time in 7 years without dreaming. For 3 weeks after Christmas, I lived inside a dream. I know that is what it was now, looking back. A dream. But while I was inside it, I thought it was a life. Silas smiled sometimes. Not often, but sometimes. He smiled once when Eli read an entire chapter of Genesis out loud without a mistake. He smiled once when I burned a batch of biscuits so hard they could have been used as door weights, and he ate 2 of them anyway and asked for more. Tom got strong enough to ride again. He sat on the porch in the afternoons and taught Eli songs he had learned as a child. Go tell it on the mountain. Wade in the water. I heard those old spirituals drifting in through the kitchen window while I made stew, and it was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. And then, on a Tuesday in the middle of January, everything broke. A sheriff's deputy from Cheyenne rode up the drive in the middle of the afternoon. He handed Silas a paper. Silas read it standing on the porch. Then he handed it to me. I read it. The paper said that Silas's temporary guardianship over Elijah, no last name given, was voided. The reason given was a missing notary seal on the original filing. The boy was to be returned to the Cheyenne Orphan Placement Office within 14 days, or federal marshals would be sent for him. The deputy tipped his hat and rode away. Silas said very quiet, "Ashford." I said, "I know." That same morning, Tom found 23 head of our cattle dead at the North Water Hole. He rode in, and he told us with his face gone gray. Silas went out and looked at the cattle. When he came back, he said one word: arsenic. It had been put in the spring above the water hole, up in the rocks where nobody would see it unless they knew to look. 23 head, around $2,800, gone in one night. That was the day I went looking in the library drawer. It was nothing to do with Ashford, or with the cattle. It was a small thing. Eli had come down with a low fever, and I wanted the medicine chest. I remembered Silas had said once that it was in the library. I did not want to disturb him. He was out in the north pasture counting the dead, so I went into the library alone. I opened the drawer of the big writing desk. I did not find the medicine chest. I found a tin box, and inside the tin box I found an envelope with my own name on it. My knees went loose. I sat down in Silas's leather chair. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 papers. The first was a promissory note, signed by my husband Matthew Whitfield, dated the 11th of March, 1879, for $2,400, payable to Silas Crane, no interest, no due date. The second was a letter in Silas's own handwriting, dated the 10th of August, 1882. 2 months before the day in the cattle market. It was a letter to nobody, or to himself. The kind of thing a man writes when he's trying to work a thing out in his own head. It said, and I will remember these words until I die, Mrs. Whitfield will lose her place by spring. Ashford has bought up her note through a straw man, Harmon. I have to step in. I cannot let Matthew's widow be put out on the road. I owe that man my life twice over. On the 15th of October, I will be in Cheyenne. I will find a way to speak with her. I sat with that paper in my hand for a long time. Everything I had believed for 3 months rearranged itself in my head. He knew me. Before he ever met me, he knew I was Matthew Whitfield's widow. He knew I was losing my place. He had planned to be in Cheyenne that October day, which meant the meeting in the cattle market was not an accident, which meant perhaps that Eli had not been an accident either, which meant that every bit of kindness I had received, from the first bandage on his bleeding hand to the small shoe placed in my own, might not have been kindness. It might have been a careful, patient hand moving me into position, like a chess piece. I heard Silas come in through the kitchen. I did not put the papers back in the drawer. I walked out into the kitchen with them in my hand. He was washing his face at the basin. When he straightened up and saw what I was holding, he did not pretend. I will give him that. He did not pretend. He said, "Clara, let me explain." I said, "Do not call me Clara." He said, "Mrs. Crane, please sit down. Let me explain." I did not sit. He said, "Every word in those papers is true. Matthew borrowed that money in '79. I never asked him to repay it. When he died, I let the note lie. Ashford bought a secondary lien on your place through Harmon without my knowing, and by the time I found out, he had the bank behind him. I wrote that letter in August because I knew you were in trouble and I meant to come find you. I did plan to be in Cheyenne that October." I said, "And the boy?" He said, "Clara, that I swear to you on the grave of my wife and my son, I did not know that boy would be there. I did not arrange that. I had never seen him in my life. Everything that happened at the cattle market happened the way you saw it happen. Every word that boy spoke was his own." I said, "Then the marriage, then the suppers, then the shoe. You gave me that shoe because you wanted me to trust you, did you not?" He went very still. Then he said the thing I could not bear. He said, "Clara, I cannot prove what I feel. I can only tell you what I know. It began as a promise to Matthew. But I was in love with you by the 3rd week. I did not know. I thought it was gratitude. The night you saved Tom, I knew. Christmas Eve. I knew I could not let you walk away in October. But I did not know how to say it to you. Because I had been the creditor. Because I had shaped your circumstances without telling you. I was afraid. I was a coward. I am sorry." I did not answer. I walked past him. I went up the stairs. I packed 2 bags. I got Eli out of bed, and I told him, "Eli, put on your coat. We are going into town for the night." Eli said, "Mama, why?" I said, "Because I need to think. But you are coming with me. You are not leaving my side." Eli started to cry. He did not fight. He put his coat on. Silas was standing on the porch when I came down with the bags. He did not stop me. He said one thing only. He said, "Clara, my door is open. To you and the boy. Always." I hitched up the small buckboard. I drove out into the early dark with Eli wrapped in a blanket beside me. It was starting to snow. By the time we reached Cheyenne, near midnight, it was a blizzard. Mrs. Hattie opened her door without a word of reproach. She gave us a room. Eli fell asleep with his fist wrapped in my skirt. I sat up all night at the window. I thought, I have trusted 2 men in my life. Both times I have been a fool. I thought, I am going to lose the land. They are going to take Eli. I thought, maybe Thomas did not die because of God. Maybe I have never been worthy of a child. And I thought those thoughts for 4 hours in the cold dark. And then, somewhere near 4 in the morning, I thought one more thing. Silas did not deny any of it. He could have lied. He had his chance, and he did not. That is not what a man who means to trap you does. That is what a man who is ashamed does. I did not forgive him. Not yet. but I knew before dawn that I was going to have to act, not react. Act. In the morning, Mrs. Hattie brought coffee up to our room. She did not offer comfort. Hattie never offered comfort. She offered the truth, which is better. She set the cup down and she sat on the edge of the bed. Eli was still sleeping in my lap, his mouth open, his hair damp from the snow of the night before. Hattie said, "Clara, I am 62 years old. I have buried 3 husbands. I have lost 2 children in their cradles. I am going to tell you what your own mother would have told you if she had lived." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Grief is not a reason to refuse love. It is the reason you know love is worth fighting for. You are not running from that man, Clara. You are running because you are afraid he actually loves you, and if he does, then you have to learn to love him back. And that is the hardest thing a broken person can do, harder than losing a piece of land, harder than bearing a child." "I know, child, I know." I did not speak. Hattie said, "Now, I am going to show you something." She pulled a key from the cord around her neck. She stood up. She led me down the back hall of the boarding house to a small pantry with a locked cabinet. She opened the cabinet. Inside was a stack of papers near a foot thick. She said, "For 6 months I have been listening. I run a boarding house, Clara. Men come here, they drink, they talk. They think the old widow behind the counter is half deaf and they do not lower their voices. I have been writing down what I hear, names, dates, figures, who is buying what land through which straw man for which railroad, who is paying who to look the other way at the placement office. I have been waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Are you brave enough, Clara?" I looked at that stack of paper. I thought about Silas, about Eli, about Nell in Laramie with the bruise on her wrist, about 23 head of poisoned cattle, about a letter I had found in a drawer. I said, "Yes, Hattie, I am." I did not go back to the Bar C, not yet. I took the morning train to Denver with Eli and with Hattie's papers wrapped in oiled cloth in my bag. I had $80 left in the world. It bought me 2 tickets and 3 nights at a cheap hotel. On the second day in Denver, I found Dr. Heinrich Schneider. He was 60 now, chief physician at Denver General Hospital. A tall, thin man with white hair and spectacles and hands that still did not shake. He looked up from his desk when the nurse showed me in, and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Clara Brennan, good Lord above, you are alive." Brennan was my name before I married Matthew. I sat down across from him. I told him everything, in one sitting, 3 hours without stopping. I told him about Thomas, and about Matthew, and about the land. I told him about the cattle market, and about Silas, and about Eli. I told him about Nell. I told him about Victor Ashford. I laid Mrs. Hattie's papers on his desk. When I was finished, Dr. Schneider took his spectacles off, and he wiped them on a handkerchief. He put them back on. He looked at the papers for 10 minutes in silence. Then he said, "Clara, I am going to make a telegram, 2 telegrams. Wait here." He was gone an hour. When he came back, he said, "We are taking the morning train to Cheyenne. Tomorrow, you and I and the boy. My wife will come also. I have a friend named Elias Grant, a federal attorney in Denver who owes me a favor. He will meet us there. And I have written to the governor of Colorado. His daughter's life I saved 3 years ago, as perhaps you recall. He will write me a letter of introduction to Judge Harlan before the sun sets today." I started to cry. Dr. Schneider said, "Clara, stop that. We are not done yet. We have work to do. Crying is for afterward." He pulled a drawer open in his desk. He reached far in the back. He drew out a leather folder I had not seen in 18 years. He said, "I kept this in case." Inside was my Army service record, filed in 1865, Heinrich Schneider's handwriting across the top, certifying the nursing service of Clara Brennan, age 16 to 19, from May 1864 to June 1865, attached to the Surgical Corps of the 9th Army Corps. I held it in my hands. I said, "You kept this for 18 years. He said, "Clara, I kept it because I have known hundreds of doctors in my life. I have known 3 nurses worth the name. You were one of them. I was not going to let that paper be thrown away. Come, we have a train to catch." We reached Cheyenne on a Friday. Judge Harlan saw me at 2 o'clock that afternoon in his chambers. He had the governor's letter in his hand. He had Dr. Schneider at my side. He had my service record on the desk. I filed a petition to adopt Elijah, surname unknown, in my own name, as Clara Crane, wife of Silas Crane of the Bar C Ranch, Laramie County. Judge Harlan granted it on the spot. He granted temporary custody to me pending the full hearing, which meant that Victor Ashford's 14-day order was overridden, and Eli was legally mine under the law of the territory of Wyoming. Elias Grant filed Mrs. Hattie's papers with the federal court that same afternoon. He filed a formal complaint against Victor Ashford for federal land fraud. He filed an ancillary complaint against the Cheyenne Orphan Placement Office. 3 days later, Victor Ashford was arrested. I went to see him in the jail. I did not speak to him. I just stood on the other side of the bars and looked at him through them. He said something I will not put in this book. I turned around and I walked out. On the 28th of January, 1883, the Cheyenne Daily Leader ran my letter on the front page. It was a long letter. I had worked on it for 2 nights. It began, "I stood in the cattle market that day. I heard the boy ask if he might cost less than a horse. Now I put the question to you, citizens of Wyoming. Mothers, fathers, men and women of faith. What have we built in the West, if not a place where every soul has a price? We left Virginia, Ireland, New York to build a better country. But we brought the old sickness with us, the belief that a human being can be bought. I say never again, not in Wyoming, not while I draw breath." The letter was reprinted in Denver, in Omaha, in St. Louis, and in the Chicago Tribune. A reform movement began that winter. But the thing I did that mattered most was smaller and quieter. I drove down with Elias Grant to the Harlow Farm south of Laramie on the 2nd of February. I paid out Nell McCready's indenture with money Dr. Schneider loaned me, $300. I drove back with that girl in the buckboard beside me, wrapped in my own coat because she did not own one. I delivered her to Mrs. Hattie's boarding house. Hattie was at the door waiting. Nell looked up at Hattie and she did not speak. She could not. Hattie said, "Child, come in. There is a bed upstairs and a hot bath in the back and stew on the stove. You are not anyone's property anymore. You are just Nell, and you will be Nell from now on." Nell broke. I left them holding each other in the hallway. There was one more thing I had to do. I went to the Cheyenne Bank. I drew out the last of my savings. I added the loan Dr. Schneider had written me. I bought a bank draft for $2,400 payable to Silas Crane, and then I drove the buckboard home with Eli beside me. I came back to the Bar C on a clear afternoon in the first week of February. The sky was that hard, bright, washed-out blue you only see over the plains in winter. The snow in the valley was so white, it hurt my eyes. Smoke came up from the chimney of the house in a clean, straight line. I drove up to the gate. I did not go in. Silas was in the barn. I could see him through the open doors. He was mending a harness. He looked up when he heard the wheels. He stood very still. He came out into the yard. He was thinner than I remembered. His eyes were set deeper. He had not been sleeping. I got down from the buckboard. Eli stayed up on the seat, wrapped in the blanket, watching. I held out an envelope. I said, "Silas, I found this in an old trunk of Matthew's at my house before I went to Denver. I did not read it until last week. You need to read it." Silas took the envelope. He opened it on the spot. Inside was a letter, in my husband Matthew's handwriting, dated the 3rd of June, 1880, 2 weeks before Matthew died. I had not written it. I had found it in a trunk in the cellar of my old house the day before I took the train to Denver. Matthew had written it and never sent it. I had read it once. I had folded it up. I had carried it with me to Denver and back. And I had not been able to give it to Silas until this moment, because I had not yet known who I was going to be when I handed it over. Silas read it standing there in the yard. The letter said, "Silas, my brother from Shiloh. I know I am dying. The doctor says my lungs are filling, 3 weeks at most. I have one last thing to ask of you. Not because I deserve it. I have let you loan me money I cannot repay. I ask for Clara's sake. When I am gone, she will not survive, not in the body. She is 10 times stronger than I have ever been. But her heart has been breaking since Thomas. I have watched her disappear night after night for 2 years. I could not reach her. She built a wall I could not climb. Silas, I do not ask you to love her. I ask only that you do not let her be swallowed. Keep her near, in whatever way you can. I know you are broken too. Eleanor, Benjamin. Perhaps two broken souls can find a way through the winter together, perhaps not. I do not ask for miracles, I ask only for kindness. I do not command, I beg. Matthew. Silas read it twice. He sat down on the snow-covered step of the barn. His hand was shaking. He said, I never got this letter. I said, Matthew wrote it, and he was afraid to send it. He thought it was too much to ask. I found it in a trunk. Silas, all those things you did, they were not because he asked you to. He never asked you. You did them because of who you are. Silas looked up at me. He said, Clara, I need you to hear one thing. I said, I am listening. He said, when I rode into Cheyenne that October day, I did not know it was you on the street. I did not know what the widow of Matthew Whitfield looked like. I had never met her. I saw a woman on the corner of Railroad Avenue weeping over a child who was not her own. That is who I saw. I did not know you were you. I asked Hattie that night who you were. I did not love you because of Matthew, Clara. I came close to you because of you. I walked across the yard. I sat down on the step beside him. I said, Silas Crane, stand up. He stood up. I stood up. I said, I want a divorce. He went still. I said, I want to divorce the contract, the paper, every clause of it. I want you to tear it up, Silas Crane. He waited. I said, and then if you want, I want you to marry me again. This time not for the land, not for Eli, not for a promise to Matthew, not because you were the creditor or I was the widow or we were two lonely souls needing each other through one Wyoming winter. I want you to marry me because I choose you. I have seen the other choices. I have been offered some of them by men I would not give the time of day. I choose you every morning, every night, every winter I have left in me, and I need you to choose me back. Silas reached into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small cloth pouch. He said, I had this made in Denver in December. I never had the courage to give it to you. I have been carrying it in my coat for 8 weeks. He opened the pouch. Inside was a ring, plain silver, no stones, just a thin band. He took my hand. He slid the brass ring off. He put the silver ring on in its place. Inside the silver band, engraved in small, neat letters, were 2 words. He said, Clara Brennan Whitfield Crane, I choose you. Every day, every storm, until the day they lay me in the ground of this valley. I did not kiss him. I took his hand and I led him over to the buckboard. Eli was still sitting up there on the seat with the blanket around him. I said, Eli, come down here a minute. He climbed down. I said, Pa, Silas and I are going to be married again, properly this time, in the spring, under the big oak down by the creek. Is that all right with you? Eli looked at Silas. Silas knelt down in the snow. Silas said, Eli, son, and while we are on the subject, I would like to ask you something. I did not ask you in Cheyenne. I wasn't fair to you. I am asking now. Would you let me be your father on the paper? You would be Elijah Crane, but I will not do it without your word. Eli stood very straight. He said, Yes, sir, Pa, I would be proud, and I will make that name proud back. Silas put his hand on the top of Eli's head. I put my arms around both of them. The 3 of us stood like that in the snow in front of the barn for a long time. The wind moved across the valley. Up on the porch of his small cabin, Tom Garrett was watching. He had his hat in his hand. I saw him take the hat off and press it to his chest. He had not done that since the day of his emancipation in 1863. The wedding was held on the 10th of June, 1883, under the old oak down by the Western Creek, not in a church, under the open sky. Mrs. Hattie came up from Cheyenne. She was our matron of honor. 62, and in a lavender dress with white lace at the collar. Dr. Heinrich Schneider came up from Denver with his wife. Nell McCready, 16 now, and already training as a nurse with Dr. Schneider's people, came as one of my bridesmaids in a pale green dress we had sewn together the week before. Judge Harlan came, and his wife. Near 40 neighbors from the valley came. 3 other children from the same orphan train, now in good homes because of the reform I had helped start, came with their new families. Old Tom walked me down the aisle. My father was long in the grave. Tom was the most dependable man I had. He held my arm the whole way. At the end, he put my hand into Silas's hand. He stepped back. He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. Eli stood between us. He held the 2 rings on a small red velvet pillow. Reverend James Holloway, the young minister from Laramie who had himself come west on an orphan train when he was a boy, performed the ceremony. He said this. I remember the words because Silas wrote them down for me afterward. He said, "Friends, marriage is not the meeting of 2 perfect souls. Marriage is the vow of 2 imperfect souls that they will learn to love, each day, each season, through every storm. I grew up an orphan myself. I know the world is not always kind. I know there are men who believe you can put a price on a soul. But today, in this meadow, under this sky, we declare another truth. That the human soul is not for sale, that love is a choice, not a commodity, that every child and every woman and every man is beyond price. Clara, Silas, remember this. Eli, you remember this too, and teach it to your own children. That is the most important lesson of this age." Silas and I said our vows. This time we said all of them, including the ones about loving and cherishing. When Reverend Holloway said the words, "You may kiss the bride," Silas kissed me for the first time. On the mouth, in front of 40 people and 1 small son. Eli clapped. Then everybody clapped. Silas danced with me first on the plank floor we had laid over the grass, a fiddle and a harmonica for music. He danced with Eli next. Then he danced with Mrs. Hattie, who laughed the whole way through it. Then he danced with Nell. And Nell, who had not smiled since she had been put on a train in New York 2 years before, smiled the whole way through. 5 years passed. Autumn of 1888. I will not draw this out. You have come a long way with me, and it is right that we finish. I sit on the porch of the Bar C today as I put down the last of this account. I am 39 years old. My daughter, Eleanor Rose, is 3. She has red hair from Silas's mother, who I never met. She is trying, at this moment, to teach a chicken to read out of the Bible. Silas says I have raised a theologian or a mad woman, and he cannot yet tell which. Eli is 15. He is as tall as his father. He was accepted last week to the Denver Medical College. He wants to be a doctor like Heinrich Schneider. He means to come back to Wyoming and open a clinic for orphaned children. I have not told him yet, but every night I kneel at my bedside and I thank God for the October morning in the cattle market 8 years ago. My women and children's clinic in Laramie has 4 trained nurses. Nell runs it when I am at the ranch. She's engaged to be married to an Irish blacksmith named Connor. I pray nightly for their happiness, and I believe my prayers will be answered because I have watched that young man look at her the way Silas once looked at me on the porch in the moonlight. Silas bought back my old place from the Ashford estate 2 years ago. I had said I did not want it, but he said some land should be kept whole for the generations. I let him win that one. The house is let now to a young family with 3 children. The wife calls me Mrs. Crane, and she keeps the parlor cleaner than I ever did. Old Tom is 77. He does not work anymore. He sits on the porch of his own cabin every morning, and Eli brings him a cup of coffee, and he tells his stories. About Mississippi, about the Day of Freedom in 1863, about how Silas found him in Kansas in 1867 and said, "You are a free man, Mr. Garrett, but if you want to build something, I have land and not much else." Eli knows every one of those stories by heart. He will carry them forward. I know he will. I have published 17 essays in the Cheyenne Daily Leader on the reform of the orphan system. The governor of Wyoming signed a law last winter making the auction of children in this territory illegal. The law is called Elijah's Law. Silas wept when he read the news. Silas does not weep, except 3 times. On Christmas Eve of 1882. on the day we were married the second time, and on the day the governor signed that bill. Victor Ashford is in the federal prison at Leavenworth, 17 years. I do not rejoice at it, but I do not grieve either. Sometimes justice looks that way. On my mantelpiece today there are 3 things: Benjamin's small brown shoe, Thomas's white handkerchief, Eli's mother's Bible with the lullaby written inside the back cover in her small, neat hand. I had thought last month of putting them away. Eleanor Rose is old enough to ask about them, but Silas and I decided, no, they stay. When our daughter asks, we will tell her about the brother she will never meet who burned in a fire in 1875, about her other brother who died of fever in a little house outside Laramie, about the mother who wrote music in Gaelic for her son, 3 souls who loved before our daughter was born, and it is that love that is the reason she is here at all. Love is not a finite thing, friends. It is not a cup that empties the more you pour it. It is a flame, and the more you share it, the larger it grows. Thomas was not replaced by Eleanor Rose. Benjamin was not replaced by Eli. Matthew was not replaced by Silas. They are all here, in this house, in my heart, all at once, none of them pushed aside, none of them forgotten. I will close with one scene. It happened yesterday evening as I was coming down to set the table. Eli was out on the porch with Silas. Eli had ridden in from school in Laramie on the horse Silas had given him for his 14th birthday. Eleanor Rose was chasing a butterfly at the edge of the yard. Tom was singing low to himself on his own porch. Eli was leaning on the rail beside his father. He said something I could just hear through the open window. Eli said, "Pa." Silas said, "Son?" Eli said, "I was thinking today about the day you brought me home. The day at the cattle market. I asked you a fool question." Silas turned to face him. Silas said, "Eli, that was not a fool question. That was the most important question any man has ever asked me. Do you know why?" Eli said, "Why, Pa?" Silas said, "Because you taught me something I had forgotten since I was a boy sold in Missouri myself. That no human being on this earth is worth less than a horse, not a child, not a woman, not a freedman, not an immigrant, not any soul. And any society that dares put a price on a child's head is a society that must be changed, one heart at a time, starting with our own. You taught me that. I will owe you for it the rest of my days." Eli stood up straight. He said, "Pa, I will take that to Denver with me. I will take it to the clinic I'm going to open. I will teach it to every orphan boy I meet for as long as I have breath." Silas put his arm around his son. Eli let him. And I stood in the doorway with a stack of plates in my hands, and I watched them, and I understood at last what the whole of my life had been for. I came to Wyoming to sell a wedding ring. I left with a family. The world asked a boy if he might cost less than a horse. A man answered no, and that answer wrote the rest of my life. If anyone reads this book after I'm gone, I hope you will remember this. Every soul on this earth was set here by a hand more careful than our own. No soul has a price. Every soul is a gift. Choose to love them every day, as though for the first time. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
Friends, before you click away, I want you to sit with me for just a moment longer, because the story you just heard was never really about Wyoming. It was never really about a ranch, or a cattle market, or a silver ring slipped onto a widow's finger in the snow. This story was about a question, a single question, asked by a small boy in a dirty coat on a wooden platform in October. Can orphans cost less than horses? And I want you to understand something. That question did not just change Silas Crane's life. It did not just change Clara Whitfield's life. It changed yours too, the moment you heard it. Because a question like that, once it enters your heart, does not leave. It stays there, quiet, patient, asking you what kind of person you are going to be when your turn comes. Here is what the Old West teaches us, and what this story carries forward. Every soul you meet is carrying something: a buried child, a burned house, a name they were given by people who did not love them. You will not always see the wound, but it is there. And the kindest thing a human being can do in this short life is to look at another soul and say, I see you. You are not for sale. You are not disposable. You are not less than. Clara thought she went to the Bar C to save her land. She was wrong. She went to save herself. And Silas thought he paid $90 to rescue a boy. He was wrong too. That boy rescued him. That is how love works in this world, friends. It does not travel in one direction. When you pour it out, it comes back through a door you did not even know was open. Now hear the lesson. Grief is not the end of your story. It is the soil. What you plant in it is up to you. Clara planted kindness, Silas planted patience, Eli planted hope, and out of 3 broken hearts grew a family, a clinic, a law, and a legacy that will outlive them all. So if you are watching this tonight, and you are carrying a loss you think you cannot survive, I want you to hear me. The hands that failed to save the one you loved are the same hands that can still save someone else. Your worst day is not your last day, and the love you thought was buried with them is not gone. It is waiting for you to give it somewhere new. Do not let the world teach you to put a price on a soul. Not yours, not your neighbor's, not a child's, not an old man on a porch, not a young woman with a bruise on her wrist. Every soul is beyond price. Every soul is a gift. Choose to love them, every day, as though for the first time.